This session is kind of one of those in my heart sessions. I am not a cognitive scientist. I don't do learning science work, but I am a consumer of education and research, and I have often felt that the learning science centers that were funded by the National Science Foundation produced basic research that was of the highest quality. And it is almost heartbreaking to know that these kinds of centers are no longer going to be funded under the current configuration at NSF. I'm hoping that all of you that are in the audience will take this to heart, talk to some people about it, because the beauty and value of the learning science centers is something that I, as a consumer, feel every time I pick up one of these studies. I say, this is just so elegant, so well done. And it's the kind of example that we want to use with our graduate students to show how to do this kind of work. I was thrilled that Nora and David agreed to put this panel together. I wish that I had all of Congress out there sitting, listening to this work. I know that you will feel, as I do, that how privileged it is to have these really fabulous scientists come to talk to us today about what I consider to be really the very best kind of work that comes out of what we do. Thank you very much for coming. We know that there are all kinds of problems that are going on now with social and behavioral research. I would hope that many of you will get engaged with that dialogue because we are all in this together. We need to support cognitive science. We need to support it in strong ways, and we need NSF to support it. And if we ever need to say, well, what came out of it that mattered? This is what came out of it that mattered. And we should all feel really good about it. And David said, you mean you're not going to stay for my talk, David? I wouldn't never walk to that door while you were talking, ever. So thank you all for being here, and I'm just going to scoot down.
Okay, I want to talk about NSF, IES, and educational research and what's happened in the last 10 or 12 years. I call it a decade of expansion and enrichment. Well, about 10 or 12 years ago, 2000, 2003, there were some major funding and policy initiatives related to learning and education that took place in Washington. One of them was NCLB. Another one was the Education Sciences Reform Act. And the third one was the National Science Foundation started the SLC program. Let me talk about this one first. As you know by now, NCLB raised many highly controversial questions and issues about balance of power between state and local government, emphasis on high-stakes tests, focus on math and reading to the exclusion of other areas, excessive student and teacher assessments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to talk about that part of NCLB. What I will talk about, the part of NCLB that was quite remarkable and unprecedented, was its emphasis on improving the science in research and education research so as to formulate what it called scientifically based educational practices. And from the legislation itself, if you actually looked at this legislation, you'd see this sort of thing about school districts using relevant scientifically based research, about targeted assistance programs using scientifically based research. These quotes are taken literally from the NCLB legislation, a huge document. So this is an act of Congress. Scientifically based research, school districts have to incorporate scientifically based research in their improvement plans, and so on and so forth. This phrase is used over 100 times in the legislation. That fact itself has probably been stated over 100 times. It kind of gets recursive after a while. It was so striking to so many people in the field. Well, what is it? What is scientifically based research? And the Act went on to define it, took the audacity to define what scientifically based research is, as defined in NCLB. Systematic empirical methods, rigorous data analysis, measurements or observational methods that provide reliable and valid data, experimental or quasi-experimental designs with a preference for random assignment, which caused a lot of heat. Studies being presented in sufficient detail so they could be replicated, and also going through the journal process or the scientific vetting process, that everything should appear in rigorous, objective, and scientifically reviewed journals. These ideas were elaborated around the same time by a report from the National Academy of Sciences. Rich Shavelson and Lisa Town put this together. This book has by now had over 800 citations. I just looked yesterday. And the book also not just described what scientific research was, it also described what an agency should look like that was going to support scientific research, and it really described the way IES turned out in many large respects. The Education Sciences Reform Act is actually the act, another congressional act, that established IES. So that was the second big thing that happened. And IES, Education Sciences, defined IES in a certain way. Its mission was to provide scientific evidence on which to ground practice and policy. Its annual budget, about $600 million, of which about $200 million is for research. These are hard numbers to extract. It depends what you count. And the scientific disciplines whose findings can contribute to improved educational practice, and the disciplines that feel very comfortable with many parts of IES include cognitive psychology, cognitive neuroscience, developmental psychophysics, economics, statistics. All these fields have applied for and received research support from IES over the years. Third big thing was right around the same time, the National Science Foundation started the SLC program, Science of Learning Centers. The goals of those centers was to, one, advance all the frontiers of the sciences of learning through integrated research, and to connect research to specific scientific, technological, educational workforce challenges. The annual budget for the entire SLC program was about $20 million a year. It varied from year to year, and it currently includes the following large SLCs. Some of these started a little later than 2003. Some are closing down right now in their final years, but this includes the group at Northwestern, Chicago, Penn, and Temple, where Nora Newcomb is from, the Life Center on the West Coast, the PSLC, where I'm from, a joint venture between Carnegie Mellon University and University of Pittsburgh, the one at Gallaudet, Celeste, and the one at UCSD. So, on one side of the Potomac, we have NSF getting into this business. On the other side of the Potomac, over in New Jersey Avenue, we have IES getting into this business. And the question is, what's the relationship between them and AERA? Well, first thing that happened was a lot of money started to flow into the science of learning and the education sciences. Where do researchers who primarily affiliate with AERA fit into this picture? And where do they fit into this picture 10 years ago? The famous reporter from Chicago Sun-Times, Mike Royko, said that the motto of the city of Chicago should be this, which in English means, where's mine? And this became a big question about what about the full range of activities in AERA, and how would they be supported and respected and incorporated in all this funding? Well, the other day, I discovered that AERA has 177 special interest groups. Now, some of these special interest groups, for each one of us here, are very compatible with what we do. So for the kind of work that my colleagues and I do at Carnegie Mellon, you can't read all these, but here's one on advanced technologies for learning, here's one on instructional psychology, on computer applications in education, on multiple linear regression, and so on and so forth. These groups, I think, we're very happy to see all this legislation starting on both sides of the Potomac. There are other groups, other special interest groups within AERA that might not have been so happy about it. So here's one on lives of teachers, another one on semiotics in education, another one on confluent education, and so on. And there was a perception, I think, within AERA that AERA's intersection with these programs was actually pretty small. It was much smaller than it should be or that it could be. And in fact, there was a pushback from many against perceived narrow definitions of scientifically based research. So, for example, Education Researcher 2002 had an article, lead article by the authors of the SRE book, and Mike Foyer also added that to that group. And then a couple of articles in Education Researcher, be careful what you wish for, you might get it. Educational research is the hardest science of all. Culture, rigor, and science in educational research. Science rejects postmodernism. So this appeared in the flagship journal of our association. And then there were some replies to commentators. That's 2002. You would think that 10 years later, this would have all been settled and reconciled and everything would have been okay, right? Well, no. Here's the first issue of Education Researcher this year, and the articles in there look distressingly similar. Articles about what should count as educational research, research in the hard sciences and the very hard sciences. Similarities. Carl Lyman has an article. He sees things as very similar. Why understanding science matters and relevance to practice as a criterion. So, in fact, we have a continued tension, I think, between NSF and the IS definitions of education sciences and the science of learning, and some areas of AERA. We have substantial funding going to particular types of questions and particular types of research to address those questions. And we have a non-trivial proportion of the education research establishment still challenging these trends. So we have a dilemma. Well, let me now move to less history and what I think might be some possible new directions that might resolve some of these issues. How can we resolve these? I'm going to talk about two things that I think might help to resolve this. Two ways of thinking about our endeavor. One of them is called Pasteur's Quadrant. The other one has to do with timescales and causal explanations of human learning. Pasteur's Quadrant book came out in 1997. Most of you have heard about Pasteur's Quadrant, maybe not read the book, but you certainly know about the quadrant. What Stokes did in this book was, as he described it, rethinking the relation between basic and applied science. And he put up a traditional view first, that basic research necessarily precedes applied research with a temporal flow from basic to applied. So on one side you have curiosity and wonder, and you get into basic research, then you get into applied research, then you get some development projects, and finally you get technology applications, you get some social benefit. And the one area that's cited as a wonderful example of this is the basic research on condensed matter physics that eventually led up to the iPhone you have sitting in your pocket right now and the electronics in this computer that I'm using. Stokes' main argument was that this is just plain wrong. This is an incorrect view of the relationship. And he created his famous 2x2 matrix in which the consideration, two questions are, is the research inspired by considerations of use, or is the research inspired by quest for understanding? And he put Niels Bohr up here working on the Bohr atom. He put Thomas Edison down here. Edison just wanted to get the damn light bulb to stay lit. He went through thousands and thousands of attempts to do this. And up here in the pride of place is use-inspired basic research. It answers yes to both of these questions, and he called it Pasteur's Quadrant because, as you know, Pasteur kind of verified germ theory. He invented microbiology. He invented pasteurization. He had a rabies vaccine. He said that doctors ought to wash their hands when they go from one surgery to another. This is pretty much basic research, and it's also quite applied with important payoffs to the world. Well, in the next page of that book, of Pasteur's Quadrant, there's an interesting diagram that nobody ever reproduces. It shows a temporal flow among these areas. You could stay on the left side your whole career and call yourself a basic scientist. You could stay on the right side your whole career and say you're interested in really applied questions. But what Stokes noticed was that research often crisscrosses and goes back and forth between these fields through Pasteur's Quadrant into either direction. Well, I think these terms, science of learning and education sciences, can be viewed in this way, and I think it's not too much of a stretch to say that the science of learning, the main interest in NSF, is up here in the upper row. Some of it is pure basic research, but it may have very clear practical payoffs. And I think that a lot of IS's interest is over here, considerations of use. We're trying to get some basic studies done in the way that education happens, some empirical demonstrations that it works, but also that may lead to some fundamental advances in our science. You all know about the What Works Clearinghouse, and perhaps they should have another clearinghouse called the Why It Works Clearinghouse that would push a little harder on the basic research. So that's one resolution. Second resolution is an idea that's related to something Alan Newell wrote many years ago about time scales and causal explanations of human learning. My first example will take us far afield from education research. My first example of the importance of temporal scales and identification of causes by different disciplines is taken from something that happened in 1986. Some of you weren't even born in 1986, but it's still very vivid in the minds of the old-timers here. Sorry, Nora. 73 seconds later, this thing blew up. And the question is, what was the cause? What's the causal mechanism in the explosion of the Challenger launch? Well, the massive fuel tank exploded and the exterior boosters twisted away from the main structure, and that put big stresses on the entire assembly because flaming gases were shooting out from between two sections of one of the solid rocket boosters because the O-rings design leaked, and they leaked because they were too cold to remain sufficiently flexible, because the launch took place at a colder temperature than it had ever taken before, because there had already been a lot of delays and the management was anxious to get this thing off the ground, literally, and the technical information about the O-rings hadn't flowed upward fast enough, and the authority to even delay the launch wasn't clear at the moment. So we have these causes from different fields. We have a chemical explanation, we have a mechanical explanation, mechanical and chemical combined, material science. There's a meteorological explanation. Why did it crash? It crashed because it was too cold out. Cold temperature caused the crash. Well, management and policy caused the crash too. And information systems and management caused the crash. These causal mechanisms and the theories about them operate at vastly different temporal scales, very different time scales. What about causes in our fields? Well, in 1987, Alan Newell was giving the William James lectures at Harvard, and he introduced a really wonderful idea about how causal factors in our field differ according to the time scale of their mechanisms and their effects. This paper was reiterated recently in a very nice article in Wires, not Wired, Wires, by Mitch Nathan and Martha Alabali. And they noted that Newell had looked at the different kinds of activities we engage in and noticed that they have quite different timescales, and those timescales have associated with them quite different theoretical mechanisms. So at the kind of band that a lot of my colleagues at Carnegie Mellon work, we're dealing with things that happen maybe a couple of seconds to maybe over a lesson plan to maybe a few hours. And there's a theoretical framework that we found very useful, a paper by Ken Cady or Chuck Perfetti and Al Corbett, where they talk about three different kinds of events. There's instructional events that we control, there's assessment events that we create, and there's learning events that we don't see at all. They happen in the brain. But the assessment events presumably allow us to see the learning events. And their paper, their publication is really about things on a fairly short time scale. But this idea can be expanded from the cognitive band to other bands. So you can have a rational band. You could talk about curriculum reform and teacher training, where we're in the socio-cultural band. The mechanisms there are quite a different time scale. We can talk about the lifelong life effects of Head Start. We see a lot of that in the newspaper right now. What happens 20 years after Head Start? Well, if you have a theory that only functions at 10 to the minus 1 or even 10 to the squared seconds, it's not going to explain what's happening over the whole lifespan. So the take home here is that I think between the learning sciences and the science of learning, we can think about different cells in Pasteur's quadrant, that different temporal scales call for different kinds of causal accounts, and that triangulation across different time scales may first increase the coherence of our multidisciplinary approaches, and that may include a wider range of AER members. So we may go from this picture, which I think people had 10 years ago about what was going on both sides of the Potomac with respect to where AER fit in this picture, to I think this picture where AERA is much more central to the activities of both National Science Foundation, IES, the learning sciences, and the science of learning. I'm done.
Wonderful. So we have a few minutes for questions, although we're going to switch computers during those few minutes, but go for it.
Any questions? I gotta get out of here. Okay.
Barbara has a question.
Yes.
Hey, David, so you saw AERA as having a bigger role. So how does AERA have that bigger role?
How does AERA have a bigger
Bigger role? I mean,
You good? I think so. Sure.
I think maybe this is a dream, but I think that
You'll need to use the mic.
And repeat the question.
I think that both the way the RFPs and the RFAs are written from the agencies and the way people submit their work should try to explicitly include this notion of timescales, and that the kind of things they're going to account for, again, let me use the example of long-term effects of Head Start, since it's so salient and since it's something I know nothing about, that the explanation mechanisms there should not be the kind of microprocesses that people are looking at in the PSLC. They should be long-term sociological issues. There should be theories that have the same force of causal explanation, but at a very different time scale.
Another one in back?
Can you either have the questioner use the microphone or repeat the question? We couldn't hear the question in the back.
Oh, okay. So somebody just asked me a question I couldn't hear. She said she couldn't hear the questions. And the question, I don't think there's a microphone going around, so I don't know what's going to happen.
Barb's question was, how does AERA have a role?
No, I answered that question, I think.
You know, she was just pointing out she didn't know what you were answering.
Oh, I was answering, what could AERA's role be here? I think the membership should try to push a little harder to get the agencies to explicitly think about different timescales. They do kind of, IES has programs in which you sort of do a laboratory study, or you do a development study, or you do an implementation study, and that kind of gets at these longer timescales. But I think it should think more carefully about this notion of different theoretical mechanisms at different orders of magnitude of seconds.
Okay, we should probably go to Dan.
Right.
Are you ready?
That's great. As ever.
Okay.
Okay, so I am more a soldier on the ground than a policy person or a leader of fields. And so I thought I'd tell you a little bit about the inside of the Science of Learning Centers and how it relates to the learning sciences. So as a member of LIFE, which is learning in informal and formal environments, this is life's purpose. I'll let you read that. So it's pretty vast. On top of that, these were the initial disciplines of the faculty. So this is a big, sloppy thing. And, but, across all this variation, you might find some distinction between learning sciences and sciences of learning going on across all these. And so I get asked a lot, what is learning sciences? And I never quite know the answer. I kind of want to say, well, it's whatever the journal publishes, or whoever those people are that say they're learning scientists, or maybe just Janet Kolodner. I'm not sure. But I thought it was worthwhile trying to make a little push on what makes the learning sciences distinctive. And so I think its goal is to maximize human learning. And I want to draw out some of the characteristics of this kind of research. So an example of this would be what contexts facilitate identity development. And the goal would be to figure this out so you could then maximize the identities that you think are important. So I'm going to say something that's going to offend almost every learning scientist, but I think the thing that makes it stand out for me is that it is an engineering-first discipline, that people want to make things that work and then try and figure out why. They come in with some ideas. So it's very much the Pastor's Quadrant image. So let me take the example of something that came out of LIFE. It was a reconfiguration of the AP history course where the students did a lot of role playing, and it was quite successful. So one thing that was characteristic of learning science is there's normative goals. There are outcomes that we want, and we argue about which outcomes are better than others. A second issue in the learning science is design optimization. You want to make it the best possible, right? Whether you want to be more efficient or more innovative, whatever, you try and optimize the design. An important distinction is you're looking for sufficient causes. So you're not trying to say you have to have this to make it work. You're trying to say you need all of this to make it work. And so you want to start with a system where people are learning to the degree that you like. And so there you need everything in place for that to work. It tends to be in situ, in classrooms or in the field. And interestingly, it sort of leans towards domain-specific processes. So here they're looking at argumentation in history on the assumption that this is different than perhaps argumentation in science. So of course I've kind of bastardized this, and there are people who don't do exactly this. For example, Bridget Barron looked at parent roles in the development of technological fluency and identity. She's not out there designing curriculum to do this, but I do think the intent is to try and figure out how to maximize this kind of learning and development. It's in situ, you're looking for sufficient causes, and so on. So then we have the science of learning. The science of learning, I would describe as the effort to understand how systems adapt. So fair game for the science of learning would be, how does the immune system learn? This is quite different than how to maximize human learning. Some of its characteristics, I'll start with a study from early in life's history where you're looking at a hand reaching an object versus sort of a robotic-looking hand, and you're scanning the brain to see what areas activate selectively for when it's a human hand. So here it's outcome neutral. You don't actually care which part of the brain is lighting up. The goal is theory optimization. You want to be as precise and specify sort of the boundary conditions. You're looking for necessary causes. So here the goal is to say this part of the brain lights up, and that's your cause. And of course, all the brain has to light up to do this. But that's not what you're focusing on. You're not looking at the sufficient conditions. You're looking at the necessary ones, which is if this region doesn't light up, people can't tell the difference between a human hand and a robot hand. You try and isolate subsystems. So you dissect things, and here you're isolating the person from the world. They're in a scanner, a tube, a metal tube, looking at stuff. And you're trying to isolate that part of the brain that's responsible. And then interestingly, the science of learning tends towards general mechanisms, things like attention, working memory, things that are supposed to apply in all contexts. Again, this isn't always the case. So for example, Pat Kuhl did an early study on language learning where she saw infants trying to learn a new language from TV. Well, the infants weren't trying anything, but trying to learn from TV versus interacting with a person. She found they learn more from interacting with a person. So that has more of an applied quality to it. But of course, the move for her is then to say, well, is it the social or is it the interaction? So, of course, these two approaches should be synergistic, right? There's no question about that. The problem is how to foster the synergy. And I think this is a people problem, not a timescale one. How do you get people to collaborate when they have very different starting goals and approaches and what they would consider a good finding? So I'm going to use a dating analogy for starting a fresh interdisciplinary science. And so maybe all of you have, found your spouse in freshman year. Some of us haven't been so lucky, and we go on lots of dates. And so I'm going to use a typical dating scenario using the example of a neuroscientist, which would be science of learning, and an education researcher, which would be a learning science. And I'm going to talk about their collaboration in the metaphor of dating. And so I've heard all of the following quotes that I'm going to read to you. So stage 0 is blind dating. There's a principal investigator who starts looking for a possible date, someone to collaborate with, and a few emails later, there's a meeting where the couple decides it's worth a try. So the next stage, here's the educational researcher's house, and then here's the neuroscientist's house. The size is not coincidental. So stage 1 in a relationship is borrowing. You sort of want to make a connection and have them give something to you. So you say, can I borrow a cup of sugar? So this is the way it plays out in interdisciplinary collaborations. Can you get me subjects from school? Always the first question. Educational researcher, also sort of clueless, says, can you scan my kids writing a poem? And then the neuroscientist, do you have a validated test of math dysfunction? So stage 2 is giving. This is where you're trying to get them to take a little responsibility for you, a little bit of loving. So would you take care of my plant while I'm gone? So here's how it shows out in the research. Would you take care of my need to teach kids to compare nonsense words? I have this kid who's really having a hard time. Stage 3, solidifying the relationship. So move into my house, and we can build a life explaining why calculus is hard. Let's make beautiful music explaining how the amygdala shapes hippocampal encoding. And then stage 4 is procreating. The educator moves in the neuroscience house, and they have lots of beautiful, beautiful things. So a better approach to interdisciplinary collaboration. Moving in creates a bad power dynamic. The homeowner is the expert in their topic, and the other is not. And so they sort of have to sell their soul and compromise the things they find most valuable. So a better solution is to build on fresh ground. And in research, this turns into, you need to choose a novel topic that's outside of each of your immediate expertise. So you can't dominate. So back to the Life Center. At the beginning of Life Center, everybody wanted others to move into their home. Nobody was willing to compromise their research agenda. They wanted others to help them do their research. And so this was not taking advantage of center mode possibilities. So a group of faculty met for a year to find a novel learning phenomenon so people could let go of their expertise to join in. And this is something that a center affords. So what they did is they found a learning relevant and a historically important theory that happened to have been dated by the methods of the day. And this is social facilitation. And social facilitation was research with rats and humans about what does the effect of having another rat or human next to you do. And the general finding was that it improved your ability to solve problems, but it reduced your ability to learn. And the reason is because it sort of arouses you, you get excited, and that leads you to sort of execute the things you know well, but the things you don't know well, you're not going to learn so well because you're too busy executing what you already know. So this was the conclusion of Zion's, advised the student to study all alone and to arrange to take his examination in the company of other students, right? So if other people are around, you're going to be likely to do what you normally do. So the studies on that, so this seemed like an unhappy conclusion for those of us who think social interaction is important and we want learning. So the studies were always kind of odd because you were trying to compare sort of social, non-social, and equate on factors. So here's a study where people were trying to learn something in the presence of a mannequin or a real human. And to control for the effect of eyes, they had a condition where people wore like masks, or the mannequin wore the mask or not. It was an interesting study. The result was that people did very badly with a mannequin when it had its eyes weren't covered, because basically they were horrified. So now it's possible to have identical social versus non-social interactions using the computer. So we thought we could bring something new to this. And so Sandra Okita looked at students learning science, and they interacted with a character in virtual reality, and the only manipulation was, did they believe the character was being driven by a human behind it, or was the character computer generated? And otherwise, it was very crafty, all the interactions were scripted. Turned out if you thought it was a human, you learned more conceptual material, but only if you got to interact. So it was the social interaction that was the key, not just the social, not the interaction, the two together. Since then, there's been replication for spatial navigation and for grammar learning. Here you're sort of trying to learn what are allowable sequences. So this influenced the learning sciences research. So here was an example of an environment. It's called teachable agents. The child, teaches the computer how to solve and think about problems, and then the computer can solve problems on its own. And so this had already sort of satisfied sufficiency concerns. It was doing better in classrooms than what was existing at the time. But some of the sort of science of learning got infused, and so Kathy did a study where you interact with an identical environment with 8th graders in science class. The key difference was, did you think this was an agent you were teaching, or did you think this was you just working with an interesting computer program? So what she found is the teach condition learns more. The children tried harder for the agent than for themselves. And so this was interesting. It was testing some mechanisms, very much like science of learning, while creating sufficient conditions. So the research slowly got better at simultaneously addressing goals of learning science and science of learning. So Reed Stevens and Pat Poole started to look at babies learning in situ, and they discovered that if there's 2 babies in the room, they learn better than if there's 1, even though the babies aren't sort of interacting in a very rich way with each other. And so they're chasing that down. So it's in situ, but it's also looking at sufficient, but of course Pat Poole is a basic scientist. So should these become one field of study? Probably not. There are too many different things, and there's no theory accepted by all. There's not an evolution theory that can keep all the levels of description tied together. And I fear the politics of domination, where, say, NSF with hundreds of millions of dollars will make everybody become a science of learning person, and they'll lose what makes them learning scientists. So I'm not completely sure, but many thoughts. But we each need to benefit from the other traditions, clearly. And so what is the best way to ensure that? I think there's lots of possible institutional solutions, and I think you could debate them for a very long time. But as a player on the ground, in the small, you should just ask your strange bedfellow, when they give you some result that you think is trivial or uninteresting or you don't get it, you should say, why is that finding important to you? This was the key to being able to get the interdisciplinary work going, rather than dismissing or being threatened. So in the end, I want to apologize for not highlighting all of life. Each of these science of learning centers is huge. Life is no different. Here's leadership. Here's some of the faculty, researchers, and collaborators. Here's the research scientists and postdocs. Here are graduate students at Washington. Here are graduate students at Stanford. Here are people who were graduate students and now they have jobs from Washington. Here are people who have jobs from Stanford. Here are lives and interns. And there's more every year. What I just showed you was as of 2009. So these are very big enterprises. So to summarize, there are differences between the two learning fields. I don't know that there should be a science of learning science, but of course they should be bridged. I mean, how could you not think that? For immature fields like these, I think bridging is less about the methods that one can hand over a fence or theories, and it's more about finding a common question where investigators can use their respective expertise to be co-creators and equal partners. And so I will end there. Thank you.
Okay, so again, we'll have some questions and change computers. Oh, someone must have a question.
No, that's fine. It's fine. It's fine. Yes, ma'am. You can say it to me and I'll shout it again.
So yesterday I was talking to neuroscientists. I went to their session, and they were complaining about the same issues. So they want to do learning science, but they don't see educational researchers in their area. So there is this separation, and both sides are complaining about it. So why is both sides wants to go and wants to come together, but how is not happening?
So the question was, she recently observed neuroscientists and educators complaining that they can't find collaborators across. Is that close? Right, so the reason they're not succeeding in collaborating is they want the other person to move in. Right, and they want someone to help them out, and as opposed to saying, let's work on something together where we can share and use our expertise to find something new. At least that's what I've observed many times. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Nora Newcomb, and I'm from the Spatial Intelligence and Learning Center. And a quick correction to David Clark, although there's 3 SLCs represented, these are not the 3 that are sunsetting right now. The other one that's sunsetting is Celeste. So in Silk, we still have 2+ years to go. I wouldn't want anyone in NSF to start cutting off our money, so I thought I should say that. So what I want to do is actually to exemplify a certain approach to uniting disciplines, and not just science of learning and education sciences and learning sciences, but, you know, there's cognitive science and cognitive development and, you know, computer science and artificial intelligence. And in the STEM disciplines, there's the substantive content of learning physics, learning math, and so on and so forth. So one of the things that we did in Silk was to really bring together people from different disciplines around a common aim, really from the get-go. So we kind of skipped some of the dating stages that Dan talked about, or maybe we were dating earlier or something like that. So our aim has been to understand the nature of the spatial aspects of learning and to think about what it might mean to, quote unquote, spatialize the curriculum. And there had been a call in 2006, before Silk started, in a National Academy report on spatial thinking to indeed spatialize the curriculum. Now, today I'm not going to have time to make good on the promise of the title, Preschool Through College. Instead, what I'm going to do is concentrate on some examples from preschool and early elementary school years. But before I go to a real substantive slide, I want to tell you why I have a picture up there of college undergraduates on a geology field trip. Because one of the other choices that we made early in Silk was to concentrate on one science discipline in depth. We've dabbled in chemistry and dabbled in math and so on and so forth, but we worked very closely with a group of geologists to understand what goes into learning geology. Because it's such a deeply spatial discipline, we thought it would really pose problems and pose questions for us and would allow us to really expand the horizons of what psychologists and educators have traditionally thought about when they've thought about spatial thinking. And I think that has really paid off for us. We've learned a lot from geologists about kinds of thinking that we had never sort of thought about. So we started from a kind of face validity point of view where we just said, you know, there's a lot of spatial thinking in science, like look at trigonometry, isn't that all about angles? Look at angular momentum, there's all these weird diagrams. Look at, you know, geography and paleoanthropology, you have to process maps. This Google thing is one of my favorite examples. I captured it off of Google from the day that it was on there, where Rosalind Franklin had to, you know, look at her flat X-ray diffraction patterns and think, and get Watson and Crick to think about the three-dimensional structure of DNA. But there's more than face validity to the assertion that spatial thinking is involved in science and math. And this particular publication comes from a correlational study that's famous, I think, in education, the Project Talent study that was done beginning with high schoolers being tested in the 1950s. And they've been followed up. I mean, I think they're all pretty much retired today. And we know what disciplines they went into. There were, you know, 400,000 nationally representative students in Project Talent. And controlling for verbal and math ability and gender and SES and all sorts of other factors, what you see, if the bars go right, is that these people who later became engineers or computer scientists had high spatial skills when they were in high school. Now, at the top, you also see that lawyers did not have very high spatial skills, but of course, for this purpose, I don't care much about lawyers. But we also see that educators have relatively low spatial skills in high school. And that's a problem if you want to spatialize the curriculum. But this is a part of building a case for the importance of spatial thinking off of longitudinal, correlational, but still controlled research. Now, we have often wondered whether, in the early days of Silk, whether or not this was also true earlier on. So this is later in life when you're learning real science and real math. But a group at the University of Chicago, led by Liz Gunderson, who's now my colleague at Temple, has also found in 2 different longitudinal studies, also controlled for at least vocabulary, that spatial skill at age 5 predicted math at age 8. And in turn provided a little bit of a mechanism for it, because the spatialized representation of number, namely the number line, actually fully mediates that relationship between spatial skill at age 5 and math at age 8. So that starts to not only hint at this longitudinal correlation, but at a mechanism by which it could be having its effect. And let me say that I think we would not have been stimulated to do this study were we not in this center working together. A similar activity that's borne fruit recently is a longitudinal study that I've been engaged in together with my colleague at Temple, Kathy Hirsch-Pasek, and also with Roberta Golenkoff at Delaware, in which we came up with a novel way to assess spatial skill at age 3 using both 2 and 3D shapes. And we also gave kids math assessments and vocab assessments. And we found that we could predict not only spatial from spatial, age 3 to 5, but importantly that controlling, because this is a structural equation model, math at 3 predicts math at 5, but with that and vocabulary, which is actually not significant, all in the equation, the spatial at age 3 still predicts the math at age 5. So I think we now have a firm basis for thinking that this relationship holds early as well as late in life. Now, not in Silk, I think one of the important things about science of learning and centers is that they've stimulated other people to do research. They might have done it anyway, we'll never know, it's not a controlled experiment, but I think that there's been an excitement in the air about this kind of learning. So at University of Cambridge in England, Nath and Shooks have found that a Lego construction task predicts math, and that's mediated by visuospatial memory. And Colleen Ganley and Marina Vasilieva and Alana Dulani have shown that mental rotation mediates some gender differences in physical science and technology engineering test scores in middle school. Now, one of the other premises of Silk was not just that spatial thinking is important in STEM, but also that spatial thinking is malleable. If you couldn't change it, it wouldn't really matter if it was important. It would just be like, well, is red hair helpful in STEM? Well, okay, does it help to dye your hair? I mean, you could go out with that analogy, but you need to know if you can change something. And David Utall and a whole cast of characters where I'm the anchor author actually spent quite a long time. This was another thing that Silk was able to give us a platform for, doing a meta-analysis that shows that this kind of skill is malleable and that those effects generalize to other skills, and they last at least for a few months. Nobody's actually pushed it to see if they last for years, but that would be the next step. This is actually a distinction with the National Academies saying in their report, inspired by Bob Bjork, that these training effects do not generalize, but Bob now recognizes that he was wrong. And we also show this graph, which is based, it's sort of hypothetical, but it's based on 2 hard data points. So we have 2 normal distributions, and the one for after training is right-shifted relative to the one for before training by the amount that we know from the meta-analysis that you can right-shift these distributions. Then what you have in light gray is the cutoff, what you have in the vertical line towards the right is the cutoff taken from Project Talent based on the mean score of, on spatial tests of kids in high school in the 1950s who became engineers, not the lower bound, the average. So in light gray, what you see are the people who were sort of at least at the average for spatial ability for engineers. What you see in dark gray are the additional people if spatial thinking had been emphasized up till their high school testing point who would have been eligible to become engineers, which suggests the possible utility of some kind of training or some sort of spatialization of the curriculum. Now, what we have not yet got are experimental findings. You might notice that I have correlational evidence about the relationship as well as face validity evidence. I have some evidence that we can train. What I haven't showed is train spatial, get a STEM effect. Now, that is starting to be shown. There's an old study that I found on chemistry from 1983, but there are some recent publications on geoscience, physics, and calculus, and I note that none of these people are in Silk either, which I take to be a nice thing. And there are starting to be a couple of studies on kids. Yiling Cheng is actually in the audience. She worked with Kelly Nix on what I think is a lovely study. And at the University of Virginia, David Grismer has done a pretty large randomized control trial program on an after-school arts program. So I just wanted to take my remaining time to tell you about some of the tricks of the trade that we've tried to use in Silk to spatialize the curriculum. And some of the tricks of the trade come from using spatial language and then also teaching people to use maps, teaching people to use diagrams, and teaching people to read graphs. Diagrams in particular are rife in science textbooks, and teachers often think, yeah, they're just pictures, it's easy to read a diagram, I don't need to teach anyone to read a diagram. And that just is not true. But just for now, I want to show you about just one study. This is also out of the University of Chicago, and we're back to longitudinal correlational evidence, talking about the relationship between parental language, child language, and how well children do on spatial transformation tests, showing that if parents use a lot of spatial language, kids learn that language. That might not be surprising, but that mediates the effect on their increasing their spatial skills. Now, these are not words that teach you how to do mental rotation. It's rather that if you're living in a spatially rich environment and using spatial words, you develop your spatial skills. Preschool teachers might say, well, how can I use this? And the answer isn't to say, well, how many times did I say up today? The answer is to do spatially rich activities, because if you're building, you're going to use spatial words. So a lot of this comes naturally and really goes together. We also have a theme that we call learning from action to abstraction, which involves a little embodied cognition. So Cian Biluck is working with experiencing angular momentum to help people learn angular momentum. Ken Forbes is working on sketching, for instance, to help kids learn the circulation of blood in the heart, which is famously challenging for them. And Susan Golden Meadow uses gesture and has found that having kids gesture improves their mental rotation performance and also improves their ability to do these kinds of missing add-end problems. So kids often will look at 2 + 9 + 4 = what + 4 and either say that the answer is 15 because they think they should add up everything to the left of the equal sign, or maybe even that it's 19 because they think they should add up every number around, instead of adding 2 + 9. And what Susan found was that just practicing that V-shaped bracketing gesture led them to be able to understand missing add-in problems and to generalize that kind of strategy. We've also used analogy. Deidre Gentner is in our group, and she and Susan Levine and others have done a study in the Chicago Children's Museum helping kids in just a couple of minutes to understand the principle that a diagonal brace improves the stability of a skyscraper. If you have two structures in which it's pretty evident that there's one diagonal piece and not another, the other one doesn't have it, and a pair of structures where that's harder to see, and you have the kids just, which is wigglier, this one or this one? That's like the total manipulation. They will later on their exiting the museum, if appealed to, my building is wiggly, how can I make it better? They will be able to help the poor person with the wiggly building more effectively if they've seen the aligned pair of buildings. So these are some of the tricks of the trade that we think can be incorporated in a curriculum. It's also important to say, how do you incorporate that in a curriculum? And is that going to be the subject of a massive RCT or design-based research? One of the things that the University of Chicago people have been doing is to work with the everyday math people who are also at the U of C on their redesign of the elementary version of everyday math. And that is really design research. The everyday math, as I understand it, the everyday math people are making lots of changes. Some of them are informed by research out of Silk. So what we won't have is a slam dunk, like, were our tricks of the trade the ones that made everyday math better, if indeed everyday math got better, which itself would be hard to assess. But you see what I mean. I think that you can do fundamental cognitive science in a goal-directed way, bringing in many other disciplines and working closely with educators so that you are in what quadrant? I mean, sometimes I look at these quadrants and I think, well, what quadrant even am I in? Maybe I'm in those top two, the way science of learning centers ought to be. Maybe I'm not. I'm not sure. Okay, any questions? And I can also bring up Broer's presentation.
There's a question.
Yeah, go ahead. Speak up. So I think the question is about working memory training, and that's not something I do. My colleague Jason Chine does it. Jason's take is that it does hold some promise, but at the same time I deeply value the opinion of people like Randy Engel, who are pretty dubious about it. I'm not sure what the outcome is going to be. One thing that Jason's been thinking about is the possibility that it might work better for kids and adolescents than it does for adults. I don't know if that's going to pan out. So I think it's a pretty active area of research. But what I also think is that we're starting to get to a period in this kind of research where we need to do what in medicine is called comparative effectiveness. So it's not just to say, does something work, does something else not work, does this work better than business as usual controls. We can really compare different kinds of training and teaching. So when you get to math, for instance, there's all the excitement, maybe not in this room, it's more in a different kind of room, about the approximate number system. And I think that whether or not ANS training works needs to be contrasted with whether or not more traditional education in symbolic math works. I mean, it's possible that it works, but it's still a waste of time compared to symbolic math education. So these are the kinds of challenges that I think are starting to face the field. Okay.
Let's see. How do I start this puppy? Layout, new slide. Not quite. How do I start it from here? Slideshow. Hello, I'm Boris Saxberg from KAPLAN. So we're playing the kindergarten game in some ways, you know, which of these things is not the same? So I think I'm the one that's not the same. I work at KAPLAN. KAPLAN, many of you know, is the test prep company, but in fact, we're much broader than that now. We have 1 million learners plus a year. We stretch from China, Australia, across the US, out to the UK. We work with middle school students on things like math tutoring, test prep work, all the way up to workplace training of people in their 60s and 70s as they're getting their licenses and renewing their licenses. We work with students just trying to get back into the job environment after some unsuccessful work, getting a certificate in healthcare. We opened one of the first virtual law schools, as well as being a trainer for MCAT and national medical licensing exams. So we cover just an enormous stretch of human learning across decades of human learning. So I'm not exactly a researcher. I view myself and KAPLAN really as a learning engineering company. So what do I mean by that? Well, we all know what a chemical engineer is. You know, they're not chemists. We know that. They don't do chemistry, perhaps. They rely on chemistry, though, as one of their sources for getting stuff done. At the same time, in the real world of scale, they got all kinds of new problems. They got health problems, they got safety problems, and scale itself creates new problems. You look up in the ceiling, there's a very large pipe. Is that pipe going to break? Well, the guys in the lab, they only have small pipes. Their pipes never break, right? They don't have that issue, but at scale, you have brand new problems that may require new disciplines. And so any kind of engineering work is an exercise in some ways in design, in art, as well as, if you're on your best game, applications of science. One of the challenges in the education space is there isn't a lot of learning engineering going on. When you go visit the large publishers, major universities, many of which you are from, you won't find many learning engineers active who are actually hard at work trying to alter courses and make them better by applying various results from learning science or the science of learning to do that. So I'm going to talk about learning engineering at scale and what that's like, because it's an application of much of what these folks have talked about. And honestly, we need this. We need this work to keep making progress, and I want to share some of that progress. So we think there's a lot that can be done at scale using learning science. So we're applying work from Dick Clark and others on cognitive task analysis to get a better understanding of what are both the non-conscious and conscious decisions and procedures that the best experts actually decide and do. Because those should be the right outcomes for our training. Shouldn't be what a random person says or thinks verbally about what they're doing, because the research evidence is very clear. You have to get under the hood, behind the conscious curtain, to understand what is the full range of things that an expert mind does. Well, that ought to have a big role in university programs, training programs, and so forth, and it almost has none. A second piece is applying work on how do you design learning environments to make them more effective, and we'll talk more about that as we go. And of course, measuring and evaluation is a deep discipline on its own that has practical challenges at scale, but if we don't get valid and reliable information about how things are working or not working, we can't create the necessary feedback loops to improve what happens to 1 million learners. Not just laboratory learners, but 1 million learners. We need the right data that we can actually trust. We know there's a lot to improve. So we built a checklist with the Gates Foundation that they used on some post-secondary work that's designed to look at some learning science work against a variety of categories. And we created a checklist that let us, or anyone actually, it's up on my blog if anyone wants to find it. You can then look at any learning environment and decide, how are we doing? Do we have some of the basics? Now, of course, there's more learning science that you would like to apply than general issues about, are your objectives well written, are they clear and behavioral, are your assessments tied into your objectives, and so forth and so on. There's much more you could do, but these are the basics. And if you're really trying to make something, that's going to work for learning, you'd like to hit a lot of these. We analyzed a number of our own products. I am opening kimono here, right? And, it's pretty variable. Now, in fact, as an engineer working in the real world with finance and economics and time scales, the goal is not to make every one of those little bubbles there be, high quality necessarily. There may be very good reasons that you can't afford to make a small specialized course automated and highly personalized and so forth. Well, that's okay as long as you've thought about it. In fact, there is no reason I can think of why your objectives should not be clearly specified. I have asked people to come and debate with me on that inside my own organization. I've had no takers. In the same way, assessments, to not have assessments that are clear and tied to your objectives and that actually measure what you intended, have some sense of reliability or validity to them, we got to fix that, right? So we know we have potential to improve. There's no question about it. We also know our intuitions are not to be trusted about this stuff. And again, working at scale, mostly we use our intuitions to design the next lecture. Well, it doesn't work like that. So we obviously do test prep. Many of you may have at one stage taken the legal, the LSAT, the admissions test for law school admissions test. Some of the hardest things are these logical reasoning puzzles, and we see it in our own data. We've obviously taught huge numbers. That's the hardest part. We crafted a beautiful video with a workbook because video is great for learning, right? I mean, everyone knows that, and of course it's incredibly attractive, and everybody wants it, so we built fabulous high production quality video. And then one of our learning engineers working at KAPLAN Test Prep said, now, hold on a second. There's work by John Sweller on worked examples about complex problem solving. Wouldn't that has some really serious evidence it works? I mean, shouldn't we try that too? So sure enough, why not? We did a randomized control trial comparing the lovingly crafted hour-long video with a series of worked examples that John Sweller worked on with Larry Rudman in our shop. They built 15 of them because they didn't know how many of them to do. And here we go. So this was with 500 students, I believe, approximately. And on the far right, we had some students take these logical reasoning problems with no instruction at all. Then the one just next to that is the lovingly crafted video and workbook. This is painful, right? And then look at those worked example things, right? 15 and 8, they're actually just about the same. And in fact, of these, the two on the right are statistically insignificantly different, so our lovingly crafted workbook just didn't do much. The two on the left are statistically the same, but statistically significantly above the two on the right. And then here's the real kicker for practical work. The amount of time it took to do 8 worked examples was 8 minutes. The amount of time to do the video and the workbook was almost 100 minutes. So let me work this out. Let me take this really slow because I am slow, right? Let's see. It worked better. It took less time for the students. And do you guys have any idea how much professionally crafted video costs to make compared to 8 PowerPoint slides? I'm not kidding. 8 PowerPoint slides. So what are we supposed to do again? Because video is so cool. I mean, it's so good, isn't it? Right? Our intuitions are wrong about a lot of important stuff around learning. And the data says we can make a difference if we apply the science. Now, we have to apply it. That's the challenge. There's a ton of good research to guide us. This comes from the book by Ruth Clark and Richard Mayer, E-Learning and the Science of Instruction, which is a fabulous source book. There are others, but this is one that I've used for a long time. It's in its 3rd edition. It's a great compendium, and it's good guidance for instructional designers. And what you see here is a whole range of principles, multimedia principles, and combining graphics and audio, using informal language. And look at these effect sizes. 1 standard deviation or more. It takes a 50th percentile performer up to the 80th percentile. I mean, and in many cases, this does not cost more to do. In fact, in some cases, like avoiding the irrelevant graphics and videos, you are saving money. So as a learning engineer, I'm incredibly excited about learning sciences. This stuff is gold, right? So it's here to be used. And when you actually use it, you get real benefits. So we took several different courses from Kaplan University, which does bachelor's degrees, master's degrees. We took 3 different courses, and we altered it from a fairly traditional online university course that does kind of read, write, discuss, where every week you would read a passage, and then you would write a discussion forum posting, and maybe you do a little essay and take a quiz, and then rinse and repeat, right, over and over again. And instead, we threw the cognitive science kitchen sink at it, right? We made all kinds of changes to it. The way the media worked, we used motivation data from students' interactions to trigger teacher interventions. We made the tasks actually much more situated in the topics that were of interest to the student as well. We did a lot of different things. And then, and this is what's cool, we're at scale, right? So there's like 500 students a month who do these courses. So we were able to get 1,000 students together over a couple of months, randomized controlled trial, simultaneous delivery of the old course and the new course, and look to see, well, what happened? What we found is we made a measure of student success, which was defined as the students pass the course, they master the most critical objectives, and they stay on to the next course, right? They don't leave, they stay on. You know, and to us, that's a success, that's a real success. And so when you control for a variety of things about calendar and the teachers and all that, what you find is a significant lift in student performance. This was, the students were 1.6 times more likely to be successful in the pilot courses compared to the controls. And now, these are 1,000 students. I mean, this is real. These are students who have a dream to become something. And a bunch more of them are getting there when you apply this work, right? This is where the science and healthcare analogies start to really hit home for me, right? We're changing the lives of people who've had trouble with education before, using the science to lift them, because our intuitions are not very good, right? So this is powerful stuff. And as a result, we are now working to study a whole range of learning science and other kinds of evidence-based approaches. We're looking at adaptive approaches, we're improving our assessment structure, various things like self-explanation, self-summary, self-tests, a whole range of the media principles that come out of Rich Mayer's work and others, using multimedia adjustments and continuity principles and so forth. Motivation to us seems like a critical area, and many of the interventions don't seem very expensive, so we'd love to actually drive those things through as well. Social norming work, the worked examples work seems broadly applicable, so we're trying to work on that and so forth. So we can actually set up to do a whole range of studies on this because of the scale at which we work in the real world, right? That's one of the differences. And so here's one course, a composition course, college composition course. It has 1,000 or more students starting every month, right? So we can do 5 sets of 200 students in trials every month. So you do 5, and then you do 5, and you do 5, and you know what? You just keep going. That one course, if we're nimble, in a single year, we should get 50 randomized controlled trials out of it. And the key is, we're not doing randomized controlled trials to do publications. We're doing them because we're trying to predict what's going to happen at scale with some confidence. It's actually an engineering reason that we're using randomized controlled trials to see what's the impact for real. So take worked examples, works well in laboratory settings, apply it in 6 different courses, and look to see, well, what makes a difference in the outcomes? Well, that's the learning engineering work that we can do once we have learning science results to actually start from. But we need the learning science to give us confidence. That's like the stage 1 work to say, this is worth trying at scale because we have evidence that it works. And then finally, that's about testing and doing all that. But getting it to then work in the real world at scale is really hard by itself. Because we have to train the instructional designers, retrain them to think about their actions differently, right? And you know what? It turns out instructional designers are human beings too. Note to self, right? They learn, they have minds, they need practice and feedback, they need well-designed materials and experiences, otherwise they will not change their behavior either. So we've built a training program for them, and we've now gotten all 200 or so of our instructional designers through it to alter how they design things. There's a 2-month online self-study course, about 40 hours, that covers, how do you think about the quality of a product, that checklist I showed at the beginning, macro design, the analysis of tasks, micro design, and so forth. Then they meet together in teams in a 2-day workshop to make sure they've got the same understanding out of that, and to set up a series of team projects that they then execute part-time over about 4 months, which lets them actually attempt to use the principles to design real learning that matters to their own groups at scale with coaching from instructional designers who are good at this, right? So it's an actual coached experience. And so now we're in the process of evaluating, can they bring it back to actual scale, to actually get it back to scale? And this is the only way to take the learning science, test it at scale to see that it works, and then have it make an impact on 1 million or more students over time. And that's how we can truly raise student success, using the evidence. Thank you very much. Questions? I see a hand in the back. Go ahead, sir.
Okay, so you talked a lot about the real world and scale, and real world for you winds up being the people who pay for Kaplan classes. Now, there's something that you have going on where you can make these things happen fast without dealing with the sort of institutional momentum, the bureaucracy of the public school system. But where does your company see itself fitting in it, disseminating this to something that is more applicable to education K through 12, people who don't necessarily pay for Kaplan? Is that something that where's your company stand on that?
Yeah, so one of the things we are doing is we're publishing our work. We're also working with world-class researchers, whether it's John Sweller or Jeroen van Marienboer or Dick Clark or others to do this work and then get the word out and explain what we can do. I wouldn't underestimate the challenges culturally inside Kaplan of doing this. It's not as simple as it seems. Whether it's university faculty or people who've spent 10 or 20 years doing anything, changing their minds is, unless you're working with pharmaceutical means, it's really hard, right? So, we're doing the best we can, but it's not easy. And I actually also work with a variety of outside organizations like the Next Generation's Learning Challenges, the Gates Foundation, and others to help try to bring this out and across. And then finally, you've given me the opportunity to plug a book that Rick Hess and I have written called Breakthrough Leadership in the Digital Age, Using Learning Science to Reboot Schooling. And so it's intended to be a handbook for school administrators and others, together with an upfront piece that tries to lay out a simple version of what learning science has shown about expertise and memory and some of the key things that influence it. So even though we ourselves are not working right now directly in the full-on K through 12 space, we're trying to be helpful. We're also working with other companies. So I've met with Sir Michael Barber at Pearson. They're very interested in trying to be much more measurement-based and evidence-based in their approach these days. And there are other players who also see the need to apply this work at scale. And if nothing else, I hope the work we do and as we publish it, people see it as an existence proof. It can be done this way. And so now the question is, well, why aren't you doing it this way? And that would be great to be able to be that kind of example. Yes, sir, Dr. Clark.
Somebody else on the panel talked about maybe the difficulty of combining the science learning with learning science. What do you perceive to be the difficulty of scaling the outcome of that collaboration when it goes well?
So the question is that a lot of the panel here was talking about the science of learning versus learning science. And the question from Richard Clark is, what about scaling these things? And it's probably not so different from any engineering problem, or I'm also trained as a physician, so it's also the biological question, how do you use biological research? So I won't be surprised to say the closer the research is to human learning activities at some scale, the more quickly useful it is to us. So, for example, when I see some of the functional magnetic resonance imaging scans of dyslexic children and the experimental results showing that as they get better through training, you can watch their fMRIs converge. This is exciting stuff. But to me, it's like DNA research in the 1960s, where as a physician back then, you would follow with interest the explanation of things you'd seen for years that suddenly had a genetic foundation and a component, really exciting, but there was nothing to do yet. It didn't tell you what to do differently until finally something happened where it was like, oh, this means we should intervene differently, and now I have a new treatment that I can use, and suddenly it's a whole new world. Well, we haven't had that clinical use moment for most of the neuroscience as far as I know. If somebody has something, they should come up and tell me about it. So I'm following it with great interest, that really, really basic science. Results from working memory, for example, and the expertise work and all this stuff ends up feeding straight through to a lot of things that we do. Controlled trials on how media works with people trying to learn. Again, that feeds straight through to guidance for instructional design. So the closer the science work is, however you decide to call it, to live human beings trying to do real tasks, the better it is. I just had some conversations about the whole working memory training stuff the other day with somebody, And, my challenge was, okay, I see that randomized controlled trials show that you are moving a working memory number. I can do that too by giving the students the answers. But surely you're not saying that the number is what matters, right? And no, of course not. It's supposed to be the consequences of an expanded working memory that's exciting. Well, we got to finish the work, get all the way through to real tasks. And so that's the trick, is what are the real tasks that come out of it? I hope that helps. You had a question?
Yep. So you talked about working example theory, and yeah, I read about it, and we mostly use it for novice learners. But the way you are comparing video and 8 PowerPoint and saying 8 PowerPoint is more successful is depend on the way you are defining learning. And I am asking, is it learning something, taking 100 students, making those 100 students knowing all those 8 PowerPoint? Yes, it is easy. I mean, watching a video for an hour, compared to just reading 8 PowerPoint, which, I would read 2 times, then yes, I would learn it. But, what happens what happens to other learning features, like different point of view, relating the learning with your life experience? I'm asking this because KAPLAN is such a big company and assessing people. So if it is the way you are looking to assessing, it's just, I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's fair, and it's a very narrow example because the goal for learning in that case was very narrow, and it was, in that sense, a nice application of the worked examples ideas in a complex domain with a very clear end product. But we're also doing a lot of work on, we train people to become nurses and finance people and IT people and so forth, and what we know is it's really complicated. There's a rich array of skills those folks need. When you do cognitive task analyses on expert performers, you discover they've got a whole range of communication skills and a variety of domain-specific creative thinking and critical thinking skills that you've got to pay attention to if you're designing a full learning environment for those kinds of skills too. So in those environments where we're looking out for very complex outcomes like that, we're applying more things to it as well. So.
I just wanted to open it up. At this point, we have another something like 5 to 10 minutes where people can ask questions either for particular panel members or the whole panel or whatever. So go ahead. Go ahead.
Hi. So you mentioned, this is for Brewer, you mentioned that, if you want to do some chemical engineering in the world, you need a chemical engineer, not a chemist, because the chemist has a different kind of basis of knowledge. But I think there's chemical engineer programs out there. So if I wanted to be a chemical engineer, I can go get that. And as you mentioned, this question of learning engineer doesn't really exist per se right now, and you kind of see that at the institutional level. But I guess to put you on the spot, like if you designed that person or that program to train those people, what are those skills that you need that are different than, say, a learning scientist now?
Sure. So in fact, there is at least one program that's a bit like that. Carnegie Mellon University actually has a program that at one stage was called a program in learning sciences and engineering. I think they've changed the name of it, in fact, to something slightly different. METALS, METALS. You can look it up on their website. And so, yes, you need a strong background in the learning sciences to understand what's going on, but you also then need a whole range of practical disciplines as well about how do you actually manage projects, how do you plan out and estimate the costs of things, and how do you do experiments and trials at scale that are flexible and so forth. So if you're interested in more on that, that's a good place to go because they've done a good job of figuring out those requirements.
I just wanted to add, I love this idea of engineering education, but remember a lot of that is down in Edison's quadrant, and some of it might move up into Bohr's quadrant. That is, this is quite applied and practical work, but it might really raise new questions that are best answered in a science mode rather than an engineering mode.
Absolutely right.
That flow, that typical flow is so strong in most of our minds, it's easy to slip into that, and I think Stokes' insight in writing that book, Pastor's Quadrant, was to say, that isn't the way it happens at all. There's a lot of interesting questions that I can imagine basic learning scientists studying based on the work that you guys are doing.
Well, and that's partly why a number of these very good researchers are interested in working with us, because they see it as a place to scale up, to see if their ideas work at scale, and then to take problems back and say, hey, what happened? How come that's not working the way we expected?
we switch
So
over there?
I'm Edith Gummer from the National Science Foundation. I'd like to expand a little bit on Dan's metaphor around dating with learning scientists, in that we had a solicitation and a program out around an ideas lab in data-intensive research, where we really tried to force the connection between the learning sciences, computer scientists, database people, learning analytics, data mining people, and content people, to really come together to think about how do these groups get together. And I'm wondering if the group has any recommendations about what a funding agency can do around these sorts of things, and how the learning sciences community might react to it.
I don't think I have any great insights. Probably don't overprescribe. Don't do like what IES does, where you have to specify in almost NIH detail what it is you're going to do, but give them space to convene and try and find sort of low-hanging fruits where they agree they could do something interesting together.
Well, what the Ideas Lab does is it put these people together for 5 days this past October to come together and to figure out what kind of proposals they could work on together. The jury's still out as to whether what we got through the Ideas Lab is better than what we got sort of over the transom through the open solicitation.
I'd actually like to say something utterly practical, because I knew quite a lot of people who wanted to do that, who just couldn't decamp for 5 days in October when they're supposed to be teaching. So at NSF, you should consider that we all also teach university courses.
Right. Well, the timing on the Ideas Lab was a little bit problematic because it was the first week of October. Yeah. And for NSF program officers, we spent the week sitting in Washington on furlough. So timing is everything. But I have another question for the group, and that is that there are common guidelines for education, research, and development that have been jointly developed by NSF and IES. And I'm wondering if you see any potential ramifications and connections for the research and development in the learning sciences and connecting into the development of products and interventions that can be supported by providing more guidance around the guidelines.
Well, I just came across the fact that guidelines document existed as I was preparing this talk. I just saw it a few weeks ago, so I haven't read it in detail, but it was really very interesting that it was really 10 years after all this stuff started back in 2002 that it finally eventuated that both sides of the Potomac put out a document like this. I think it should get more widely circulated. I didn't see the announcement of it, but I think maybe there's a way that AERA could get notified about that document and be better able to answer your question.
Mm-hmm. Sorry?
Oh, the question is where is the document?
You can find the document on both the IES and the NSF website. If you Google Common Guidelines for Educational Research and Development, IES's pops up first because they got theirs up on the web right before NSF did. And AERA did do a session with it last year before they were announced. But I agree. I think that as the educational research and development communities become more familiar with those guidelines, we're hoping that those will open up some dialogue.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks so much for the really stimulating panel. I was wondering, do you see a way that many of the goals you propose could be achieved quickly or more easily using online educational resources? So I don't necessarily mean massive open online courses or MOOCs, but there's a big explosion in technology now with authoring tools for K-12 and universities. So maybe that would help with learning engineers, or the fact that you can just share a digital resource really easily. Maybe you can get collaborative teams looking at them, or just showing examples of the great work with the worked examples in video. I think that would be a huge finding for people who are producing high video intensive courses right now.
Yeah, in fact, that's exactly right, that a lot of what technology is making possible is not necessarily, better learning in some raw form at all. It's rather, it takes good learning or bad learning and makes it more accessible, reliable, affordable, available, and personalized, right? So, and that includes the ability to do this research much faster too. So, in fact, on Sunday there's a session a number of us are doing on the future of online research opportunities and the practical implications at scale. There's an ad in the back of the AERA book if you want to look at it. And it's exactly right. There's a lot of opportunity, and there are pitfalls because the data is not always what you hope it would be. You can end up with lots of data that's very difficult to interpret, and that's a challenge too. So there's real opportunity there, no question.
I think this session is meant to draw to a close if my watch is right. So thank you very much for coming.